misdirected through shell companies. And there, in the middle of it, was a trail of tiny lies that pointed back to him. I was the scapegoat, but the truth was louder than his smile. Staging, ticking clock, cut to flashing email headers, low register voice, pause ones after failed. My badge was placed on the table like a verdict. It was a Thursday in late October, and the sky was clear and brittle, giving the impression that the city had been polished. I remember the way the sunlight cut across the conference room and made the glass walls look like mirrors. And I recall how my boss, Damian Harris, sat at the head of the table and smiled like he was in charge of the story's conclusion. I recall opening HR's laminated folder with care and watching the documents slowly slide across the tabletop like cards in a deck. "You were responsible for reconciliation that month, Alex," Damian said in his calm, professional voice, which he used to make things sound inevitable. "We're showing a shortfall. Well, the board is not good. We have to do something." They said words like responsibility and accountability. They said things like procedural lapse and mitigating circumstances. The word that rang out loud and clear in my head each time they smiled at me was scapegoat. But they didn't say it. They didn't say that my late nights, the arguments with my wife about missed anniversaries, the emails I had copied to the wrong thread, the single column mislabeling that had hung like a razor over my head for weeks, that all of it would be bent and broken into a story that would end with me taking a fall. People in swivel chairs looked at me with a hollow pity you give to someone whose collapse you were never surprised by when they escorted me out of the office that evening, with security accompanying me quietly through the glass atrium. Damian merely nodded to me. That seemed to be it, I thought. My career turned from a straight line to a cliff at that point. When someone else's version of the truth becomes the only one that matters, you won't realize how small you feel. I listened to the conversation over and over again for weeks, looking for holes. One more email I ought to have saved. One more witness who would have supported my side. I found nothing that I couldn't read the server logs because the company owned the documents. My name had turned into the sticky residue of broken glass, which was impossible to clean up. You could say that I was naive, and in a lot of ways I was. I believed in meritocracy, in the idea that the person who works the hardest and knows the numbers would be the person anyone turned to when trouble came. That I learned quickly that power doesn't need truth. It needs a narrative that protects it. The narrative safeguarded Damian's hands. Mine was the convenient way to make his mistakes invisible. If this were a lesser story, it would end there. Scapegoated, ruined, another mid-level professional swallowed by corporate machinery. However, truth, like dissatisfaction, frequently accumulates. People talked that a few of us who had worked late together noticed irregularities, such as invoices for services that the company didn't use, travel expenses that seemed to favor one department's vendor, and a pattern of opaque consulting fees that grew around Damian's calendar. Fear of being fired grew into rage in the first October, and anger, for me, became a kind of focus. If you want to understand how I went from scapegoat to CEO, you need to see the scaffolding I built beneath that anger, that IT wasn't heroic, that IT was ours. Afternoon coffees, midnight spreadsheets, and phone calls in the laundry room, because my wife and I had to talk without children interrupting, that I began meticulously recording everything. I didn't mean to start a coup in the boardroom. Rather, I didn't trust the man at the head of that conference table, who had the most to lose if anything was revealed. To begin, I recorded everything that the company typically archived, including vendor lists, bank statements, and reconciliations. I kept copies of the spreadsheets I'd been blamed for. The most important thing I did next was start looking for patterns that Damian would want to see. When they believe no one is watching, it's amazing how much people hide in plain sight. At 3 in the morning, hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, I found my first thread that a series of vendor invoices that looked legitimate at a glance, but that, on closer inspection, included services that didn't exist, retainers for advisory support to firms that had never returned emails, and workshops with attendance lists that matched the same handful of people every time that AT first. The sums were modest, ranging from a few thousand to 2,000 or 3,000. But then the pattern bunched and swelled into something with teeth. Over 2 fiscal years, the advisory expenses that Damian's division had authorized ran into the hundreds of thousands. I had no idea what to do with that information. I considered going to HR, to the board, to a lawyer. When I carried out all three of these actions, I discovered how empty the channels were when the story they desired had already been written. HR had been loyal, unsurprisingly, to the man who signed their checks, but I was cautioned by lawyers that it was risky to make allegations without establishing irrefutable evidence. The panel? The board had been charmed. Damian had a way with them. An easy smile, a story about disruptive innovation, and an expensive suit. The more I pushed, the more it felt like trying to pry a door that someone had welded shut on purpose. As a result, I began utilizing my position to pull threads. I reconnected with mentors, former vendors who owed me favors, and an IT administrator who still occasionally checked in with us at the holiday party when we were feeling nostalgic. I asked the appropriate, minor inquiries. I inquired about billing addresses, the location from which consultants worked, and whether or not a specific meeting had taken place. I learned to ask in ways that didn't sound accusatory. You make people lower their guard by treating information like trivia, and people like sharing trivia. An inoffensive comment made in a bar, of all places, was the first significant setback. A vendor I'd known, Marta, who ran a boutique digital agency, complained about being paid late. She mentioned that her invoices had been sent through a different company in a different state whose address corresponded to that of a fake company on a different contract. She gave me the registration number of the second company over a whiskey glass that had been scratched, unaware of its significance. If you were looking for that registration number, you would find a company with a name that resembled the alter ego of a fictional character. Harris and Finch Consulting. A P.O. box and an email address were listed in the incorporation papers, which, after some digging, led back to a forwarding service that Damian's assistant used for travel arrangements. When someone else tries to hide something, things get funny complicated. You begin by following breadcrumbs, such as IP addresses, corporate registrations, and phone numbers. Vendors who have signed non-disclosure agreements and were terrified of losing their livelihoods are among the people you meet, because we were practical rather than noble. They wanted money. They wanted to avoid lawsuits. I gave them both a careful balance of confidentiality and documentation, and occasionally the subtly implied promise to locate a new vendor in the event that they were duped. I had a hefty dossier by Christmas. Invoices with P.O. boxes that were the same, emails that talked about meetings that never happened, expense reports with travel dates that didn't line up with flight logs from satellite companies. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a system. And systems are easier to hold up to the light than individual mistakes. The social aspect of corporate wrongdoing is just as problematic as its cleverness. It presupposes involvement. Because looking is awkward, it depends on people looking away. The social cost of speaking up is what makes it successful. What then changed? Two things. First, the size of the funds involved, and second, a human error that cannot be avoided. There was a Christmas party in early January, an ugly sweater affair, laughable speeches, and an open bar. Damian's smile seemed brighter that night, inflated by the compliments of the board spouses. Phil, a finance employee who had been quiet and sat in the corner for the majority of the year, got drunk and started asking questions around midnight. With the peculiar bluntness of someone who works with numbers, but is unable to keep them in check, not loudly or accusatorily. He talked about accounts that didn't reconcile, about deposits that didn't hit the ledger. It was laughed at by people. Damian made a joke. The music resumed. Phil approached me with earnest, red eyes. He stated, "I think there is something wrong with the Harris ledger. I can't sleep because I don't want to cause a scene." That was the other change. People like Phil, who had access to certain internal systems, could give what I had, anecdote and pattern, something more like technical weight. Like conspirators planning a harmless prank, we quietly pooled our resources, but our prank was to produce an accounting truth that would be difficult to ignore. Phil had access to backups and to JIRA tickets. He could pull server logs that would show who changed what and when. I had the vendor anomalies. Marta and a few vendors were willing to kindly and cautiously confirm that they had received irregular payments. Between us, we had the skeleton of proof. I'll be honest, there were moments where fear sat beside me like a person. We could face lawsuits, job loss, and the loss of our reputation if we were caught. There were nights when I imagined my wife at the table by the window with the kids and how her face would look if I never came home. She called it stubbornness. She called it righteous. She called it foolish. None of those words felt wrong. We went to the legal counsel I'd once used for a small real estate dispute, a woman named Sarah who had a reputation for barking the truth fast and sharply. She read our material and asked questions without dramatics. She stated, "You don't have everything yet, but you have more than enough to get the board's attention if you're careful. You don't want to be the guy who cries wolf. You would like to be the one who brings the wolf's fur. That's corporate theater. You stage the reveal so that the board can't ignore it without themselves appearing complicit." Sarah suggested the best audience would be the audit committee. That way, the complaint sits in a channel that every board member respects, ostensibly for reasons of prudence, not revenge. We filed a formal complaint, but not with flames and accusations. We wrote it as a request for an internal audit, highlighting discrepancies and missing verifications. We sealed our files and attached our evidence. We didn't include accusations of fraud. We let the numbers speak for themselves. Numbers are democratic in their cruelty. They don't care about the hierarchy of who's offended. The reaction was slower than I wished and quicker than I feared. The audit committee convened with a somberness that made their suits look theatrical. Damian, when confronted, adopted a posture of hurt surprise, the wounded patriarch whose only mistake was trusting the wrong people. He offered to cooperate. He promised to go through every transaction. The board accepted his cooperation. It appeared to be a victory, but you never really know until a report makes a different sound when it lands on a desk. The report landed 2 weeks later. Initial phrases included irregularities observed, insufficient documentation, and recommendations for further forensic review. The figures follow. Over the course of 4 fiscal years, millions of dollars were misappropriated. The consulting fees were diverted into personal accounts through fake companies. The audit trail had fingerprints, server log entries that showed approvals from Damian's machine at odd hours, email headers that traced a convoluted path through forwarding addresses, credit card reconciliations that didn't match expense reports. That night the office smelled different. People gathered at the water cooler, whispering. A cautious reserve had replaced Damian's once bright smile. In an emergency, the board met. I sat in the outer office and watched through the frosted glass, an audience to the slow fall of a man who had once made me a scapegoat. The audit committee chair sighed. "We can handle this internally," she said, calibrating words like a surgeon calibrates a scalpel. "We can remove him and settle with minimal public exposure, but no need for a scandal." That, for a moment, felt like a betrayal of a different kind. Justice in private is often not justice at all. But then she stopped and, as if for the first time, looked directly at me through the glass. She stated, "We'll bring in an external forensic team. We'll make sure this is thorough." It was the line I had always desired. External meant not orchestrated. External meant the truth would, for the first time in our building, not be Damian's alone to narrate. He was suspended. A brief press release from the company mentioned an internal review and a temporary leave of absence. The local tech press picked up the story in small, hungry bites. The colors of Damian's public persona became paler. Board members issued statements about upholding standards and zero tolerance. Like an occupying army, the forensic team arrived. They were quiet, efficient, and merciless with their attention. That I end contrast a narrative. Forensics is concerned with artifacts rather than charm. Metadata is scrutinized as if it were scripture. It is able to pinpoint the precise location of an open file, the machine that accessed a server, and the precise microsecond at which an email was sent. Hash values, checksum, and write protect were new to me. I discovered that the digital world has its own honest methods for rejecting lies. When the report came back, it was a thud on the table that IT was technical and painful, and rendered everything Damian had said into a series of timestamps and transactions. That IT showed a pattern of approvals made on a device with his credentials at 2:14 a.m., as well as invoices sent from forwarding addresses using the same template and tracing back to a forwarding service that was charged to Damian's assistant's corporate card. It showed transfers into accounts with names that matched shell company registries, that IT demonstrated a complex and deliberate misdirection scheme. The report's description of the scheme conveyed something intimate. It was dry, methodical, and without remorse, like reading a sad diary. The company called an emergency meeting of the board, and then, 2 days later, Damian was out. Not a graceful exit, not even a dignified resignation. Security hurriedly escorted him out of the building in the same hurry that they had used to get me to the door. Justice was perceived to have a form, a man in handcuffs, a headline with a name and a court date. The subsequent events were less cinematic, more mundane, and possibly more significant. The board, chastened and embarrassed, had to decide what to do next. They needed leadership. They needed someone who understood the systems Damian had gamed. They needed someone who could keep the ship afloat both internally and publicly. The board wanted someone who had been inside the storm and had learned its geography. So someone from the executive tier was the obvious choice. A few names came to mind as they surveyed the space. I suspect some of them thought of me as a scapegoat still. Others thought of me as the person who had documented the anomaly, who had provided the initial dossiers. There's a strange arithmetic to trusting in organizations. Sometimes the person closest to the problem becomes the person trusted to fix it because they are the only one who knows how the leak works. And the audit committee, those quiet people who understand that metrics matter more than charm, recommended I lead the interim charge. There was a split vote, which was awkward. Board members who had been loyal to Damian spoke in clipped defense of due process. Others were open about the fact that we required someone who could be open and honest, rekindle morale, and reassure investors. They appointed me as interim CEO after a lengthy legal consultation and heated discussions. It was terrifying to sit in that chair for the first time. It was the same room where my badge had been put on the table like a verdict. The glass walls reflected a different kind of person, and now the table was mine. Some people reached for my hand and squeezed it like a lifeline as they politely applauded. A straightforward text message from my wife read, "We made it." The kids were asleep and unaware, and for that hour I let myself be small with gratitude. But being interim CEO is not a coronation. This is triage. It required stabilizing the business, reassuring customers, meeting with investors, and establishing procedures to ensure that something similar would not occur again. Additionally, it required navigating a culture that had been reluctant to answer questions. People who had stayed silent suddenly had to speak. People who had looked away had to look at themselves. I made some rules right away, rules that sound simple but were in practice revolutionary there. Large discretionary expenditures could not be approved by just one person. All consulting agreements required independent bids and the signatures of at least 2 executives, one from outside the directly benefiting function. That we implemented 2-factor approvals so that expense reports could automatically reconcile with bank statements. We established a third-party managed hotline for whistleblowers. We insisted on external reviews for any contract above a certain threshold. That IT was defensive and perhaps even awkward, but it built a scaffolding that made secrecy harder. More important, I instituted a cultural change that I began the first of several listening sessions. I invited people to come if they wanted and tell stories about where processes failed them. People arrived. They told me about managers who had used fear as a weapon, about teams that didn't have enough resources, and about how the company valued charisma more than competence. To hear it hurt. It helped to know. The board didn't make me permanent immediately. They prioritized metrics, timelines, and deadlines over me. It appeared as though they wanted to ensure that justice was not retaliatory. I ran the company as if I was going to be measured every day by the numbers and the culture, that I did what I could to keep the lights on and to ensure that clients didn't bolt. Some did anyway. Trust is fragile. But we also reclaimed relationships by being honest. The hardest part wasn't policy, that IT wasn't the press or the shareholder calls, that IT was the quiet work of leadership. Calls with people who had been humiliated or used as a scapegoat in smaller ways, emails of apologies that read like a bomb, and the decision to keep a colleague who had been partially complicit but had cooperated and had family that relied on them. Vengeance is not the same as justice. It strikes a balance between repair and accountability. Then came the twist no drama writer could have plotted better. An investigation that reached into Damian's personal life and discovered a layer of collusion that involved not just suppliers and travel vendors, but also members of an outside advisory board. Damian had gained credibility from the well-known industry veterans who served as his advisors. They might have been paid, seduced, persuaded, or just too lazy to ask questions. The public fallout widened. What at first appeared to be an internal corruption scandal spread. There were lawsuits filed. Regulators asked questions. Some of it landed under the harsh light of criminal inquiry. Sometimes justice is messy. Sometimes it is clean. This time it was both. The charges against Damian would take years to clear up. Members of the advisory board resigned. The scheme's participants were the subject of an investigation and, in some cases, prosecution. The business won some lawsuits and lost others. The headlines weren't very good. Dramatic adjectives were used in the press stories. I learned to ignore the tone and focus on the ledger. How many accounts we needed to reconcile, what clients wanted to hear, and which teams needed leadership. Through that storm, the board watched me. They observed my refusal to conceal the truth in the name of corporate stability as I advocated for transparency. Some of them were amused by my insistence on transparency, and others appreciated that the company's market value stabilized as a result of our telling the truth instead of 1,000 comforting lies. Investors, oddly, rewarded transparency. The board unanimously approved my appointment as interim CEO and made the position permanent 6 months later. It was absurdly anticlimactic. There were no golden swords or fireworks. It was a small sealed envelope in a meeting room and then a note to the company. However, the weight sat differently. It felt less like triumph and more like responsibility made official. I am frequently asked if I have been traumatized by being made the scapegoat. They ask if I forgave. They ask what I learned. Those are big questions with messy answers. Did it scar me? Yes. The first months after I took the seat, I would wake up momentarily, convinced I had been called into Damian's office and accused. The cog in my chest that tightened when a senior manager used the word accountability didn't relax overnight, that I lost some faith in the simplicity of human goodness, that I learned that charm is a tool and charisma can be armor for greed. Have I forgiven? I learned to stop defining myself by what someone else did to me. Forgiveness in a corporate context is complicated. Damian did not ask for my forgiveness in public, and even if he had, I doubt I would have done so. There is a moral economy to these things. He broke trust in a way that affected thousands of people that I made the decision to concentrate on ensuring that the business does not repeat his mistakes, not out of retaliation, but to prevent harm. That felt like a kind of moral priority, if not forgiveness. What did I learn? If someone asked me how to overcome unfair blame and emerge whole and effective, I would say the following: document everything. Documentation is like oxygen in today's workplace. Your records are frequently the only thing that can help you breathe when you are being blamed. Establish secret alliances. A microphone is not required for every conflict. Respect the individuals who have access to various pieces of the puzzle, such as IT, finance, and external vendors. They become the way you broaden the circle of verified reality. Choose strategy over emotion, that it's tempting to storm the doors. It's more effective to make sure the doors are locked so the truth can walk in later. Systems, not individuals, are to blame. Take on the system when you take the lead. People are shaped by the rules they operate under. People will be driven to cheat if the rules reward secrecy, charisma, and unilateral approval. Preserve yourself. You may become consumed by exposure work. Choose your battles and keep the people who love you close. There's one more lesson I hadn't expected when this began. Empathy for the people who look away. That IT is simple to demonize those who did not assist you. They were some cowards. Some people felt stuck. Some were too small to fight that MY job. As the CEO, became to make it easier to speak up. Because cowardice is often a function of risk. That if speaking up risks livelihoods, people will calculate and decide to stay quiet, change the risk calculation, and the world often changes. My story's final scene doesn't look like a movie. There were no big confessions. That MY name was visible in the courtroom without any drama. There were, instead, mornings in the office with people who had once watched me be taken out of the building and now came to me with problems they needed help solving. That we rewired policies and rebuilt teams with a diverse oversight structure. There were open reports and public dashboards for large spending. There were still problems. The world is stubbornly resilient at creating new holes, but the old hiding places were harder to use. Once, a junior manager came into my office with shaking hands and a complaint about a vendor who had been offering exclusive deals. She had the courage to send that folder that I shut my laptop, and we read it together. That we established a small committee to oversee the process and issued an independent bid solicitation. She later told me that for the first time since the scandal, she felt safe. "It feels like we have a roof now," she said. If the arc is satisfying, it might be because, in the end, justice was served as structural change rather than as a theatrical exclamation. Damian's personal fate was a part of it, and he had to deal with the results. But that would not have been enough without the rebuilding. Accountability without repair is a hollow victory. The twist, the reveal, the thing that makes this feel like a true crime story rather than just a personal tale, is how fragile systems are, and how ordinary the people who break them can be. That I in no way did Damian resemble a monster in the movies. He was a person who had grown up in a society that valued charm more than money. When he realized he could move money in ways that nobody would notice, he rationalized his actions until they were as solid as bricks. The dangerous people are not always those who intend to harm. Often they are the ones who are never asked to be honest. If you ask me what it felt like to sit where my badge had once been dropped like a verdict, I'll tell you this. It felt like someone had given me the keys to the house that had been on fire. The need to put out fires and rebuild safe rooms was pressing. There was also a heavy responsibility to the people who had been burned before. You cannot undo what happened to them, but you can make sure the fire doesn't spread. My last public message, as I settled into the role, short, practical, and not meant for drama, was an email that I wrote about the company's responsibility to the community it served, new checks and balances, and transparency. I closed with a line I wanted everyone to read and remember. Justice is not an event, it's a practice. When I read that aloud at the town hall 2 weeks later, I watched people nod. There was skepticism on some faces. Some were tired. Some were hopeful in a cautious, realistic way. Afterward, a woman in procurement came up to me and said quietly, "Thank you for making it harder to be dishonest here." She looked like someone who had seen a dangerous thing stopped before it could destroy her livelihood. That's the ending I live with: small acts of repair, a company that didn't collapse when its leader died, and the realization that being unfairly blamed taught me an unglamorous but necessary form of leadership. I can't pretend the scars don't show. I can't pretend that I'm not more cautious now about the way people smile, the shiny words they say, and the way they offer excuses like bandages. The lesson can be summarized as follows. When the system rewards transparency, accountability is made possible. When the system rewards secrecy, crimes appear to be accidental. So I keep the policies tight, the approvals multiple, and the dashboards open. I keep reminding myself and others that the person you most trust might be the person who will let you down. The goal is to create a setting where trust is not a burden, but rather a well-structured liberty that can be easily revoked, seen, and earned. After being made the scapegoat, becoming CEO was ultimately not a story of retribution. It was a story about responsibility. It was about taking the thing that hurt me and using it to build something that could protect others. That IT was about turning the sting of blame into the scaffolding of change. If you're sitting now in a room where a man or woman smiles like they've already won, and they point you out as the problem, keep the receipts, maintain the records. Keep a small network of people who see the same things you do. Make it clear to the company that you are in a setting where no one's badge will ever again be slid across the table as a verdict. That more than anything was the justice I wanted. And in the messy, human way that justice often appears, it came. He was framed, fired, and left with a ruined reputation, only to discover a quiet trail of shell companies, fake invoices, and late-night approvals that pointed straight to his boss. Working with a handful of insiders, he built a careful dossier, triggered a forensic audit, and watched the man who'd slid his badge across the table be exposed. Then stepped into the leadership void, rebuilt the company, and changed the rules so no one else would be blamed again. Was rising to the CEO role the true justice? Or did becoming the leader risk turning him into the very thing he once fought? Join us in the comment section to hear your own side of the story. Don't forget to subscribe for more family stories on the Famigraphic Show. Thanks for watching.